I'm Dan Turner, Head of Programming and Outreach for the Georgetown County Library System, and welcome to the Friends of the Waccamaw Library, or FOWL, First Thursday. It's great to have you back. We have a wonderful program here today featuring Jennifer Berry Hawes, and the FOWL First Thursday program sponsored by our friends. They make this program and so many other programs happen. They really support our library and make it such a special place, the Waccamaw Library, and they've continued to do so even though we can't have in-person gatherings right now due to the COVID situation. They've really been absolutely stalwart in their support, and so we love them and are so grateful to Diane Stern, our president, and all the folks in the leadership and everyone who volunteers their time and their talents to really keep us going. So we really are grateful. If you're not a member of FOWL, please join up and help us out. We can use you, especially at this time, to help out. And they do have an online store. If you're missing the in-person store that's so wonderful at our library, so do go online and check out the Friends bookstore and get yourself a book online. All right, as I said, we have really we're honored and delighted to feature Jennifer Berry Hawes today as our guest for our second FOWL First Thursday, this wonderful series that Jill Santopietro, a FOWL leader, started and really got going for us. But Jennifer Berry Hawes, she's a reporter for the Post and Courier down in Charleston, where she's lived for 20 years. And she spent a decade covering religion and now conducts in-depth investigative reporting projects as part of the newspaper's watchdog and public service team. Jennifer has earned numerous honors for her work, including the Pulitzer Prize, that's a big one, a George Polk Award, a National Headliner Award, and a Dart Award for Journalism and Trauma. In her book, Grace Will Lead Us Home, The Charleston Church Massacre and the Hard, Inspiring Journey to Forgiveness, from 2019, Jennifer digs deeper to present the complex, ongoing struggles hidden beneath the headlines around the mass murder of 9 African-American church members by a white supremacist at the historic Emanuel AME Church in Charleston on June 17, 2015. She portrays the day-to-day difficulties of the Emanuel Nine families and the survivors now that the public outpouring of grief has receded, and she explores how racial divisions remain within the Holy City and beyond. The New York Times Book Review praised Jennifer as so admirably steadfast in her commitment to bearing witness that one is compelled to consider the story she tells from every possible angle. So Jennifer, welcome. Thank you so much for driving up on this glorious October morning and being here with us at the Georgetown Library.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah. And so can we start out with just a question of how you got started with this book? What made you write this, Grace Will Lead Us Home?
Well, at the newspaper, we obviously have been covering it since day one, and I was part of the team that was involved in covering it really from the beginning. The first story that I wrote about the tragedy was that night. So I was involved with writing about it on a day-to-day basis, as were many, many people in our newsroom. But as time went on and other reporters returned to their beats, reporters on our team, which do more in-depth kinds of reporting, continued on covering it. And in the fall, So the shooting occurred in June, and in the fall, I approached the survivors to see if they would be willing to let me share their story, because they had not spoken publicly about what happened up to that point. So they agreed, and I wrote a story about them, and as I got to know them, I realized that there was a lot more to what they were going through than what we were really able to get into in a lot, or in enough depth in the newspaper. And so it became clear that there really was a much broader story that we could tell, in what you can do in, a 5,000 to 10,000 word newspaper story is not what you can do in a 90, 100,000 word book. And so we decided that it was worth much, much more, and that this was a way we could tell that story adequately.
And in this book, if you haven't read it, I think you must get a copy, because it really is. I think it's, as a South Carolinian out there, there's almost a responsibility to read it. It's a South Carolina story, but it's also clearly a national story. But it's also, I think a lot of it is in the way it's written, and part of that is that you write in such a clean, objective, detached, journalistic style. You're an excellent journalist, as we heard all those accolades that you've accumulated over your career. So it's a very clean style and very fluid as well. But you're writing about such a traumatic subject and a dark subject, but also it's a very messy subject. So how did you sort of negotiate that?
Well, I wanted to tell a story as a journalist, number one, because I am a journalist, and I didn't want to tell a story that took me outside of that role, because I would still be in that role long after this book came out. I didn't want to tell a story that sold a certain perspective or that was advocating for something. I just wanted to tell the story of what happened to the people affected by this, and tell people more in depth what happened. So for me, that was the most natural way to go, was to have an opportunity to tell a story that was moving, but also was objective, and not trying to, for instance, sell you on a certain view about gun ownership, or sell you on a certain view about religion, or sell you on a certain view about race. I wanted to tell a story of the people involved, and you as the reader can come away with what you do, and that's the same as what we do, or we aim to do in the newspaper.
Yeah, it really is. I think that objectivity is so important, and it comes through. It is, in some ways, it is like a very extended quality newspaper account. But you really, you flesh it out, and you just give so many perspectives, I think is the word. There's so many voices that come through, and you're not trying to impose your voice on that. You just sort of let the families talk, and you even let the victims talk, and that's something that's very compelling. That it's almost as if we get to meet the 9 victims. They come alive again, so I guess that's a question I have. Why did you introduce us to those victims? They're not just sort of simple sketches that we might get in a newspaper article. We really get to meet those 9 folks. We hear the kind of conversations that they might have with their loved ones, with their spouses and their children, like Clementa Pinckney and Jennifer Pinckney, sort of fake arguing over their, who's going to pay this week for their daughter's dance class and things like that. So you give them a voice again, and they become real people again, and that happens with all of them. We feel like we kind of get to meet them. What was the behind that decision, and why did you do that?
Well, and I appreciate that, because that was important to me. I wanted for them, like you said, to be real people. When we write about these as journalists, about these kinds of tragedies, too often I think we think of the Emanuel Nine, or the this many people who died in this mass shooting. This many, we don't know and remember them as people, and they're all very unique human beings. Their families are all very unique and have unique views and ways they responded. So I wanted for them to be fully formed people, not cardboard cutouts of what we want them to be. And I'll give you an example. So, after the shooting, there were sort of two narratives that came out in the press and were really the driving narratives for many, many journalists who came to town and covered this story. One had to do with the forgiveness. If you remember, Dylann Roof was arrested on a Wednesday, and then that Friday he had a bond hearing. And at his bond hearing, several family members spoke of forgiving him and of Christian mercy, and it was really, really inspiring, really captivated the country's attention. But the reality is that was a very simplistic view of the families as a whole. Within even one particular person's family, you would have many, many different approaches to that. Some people instinctively wanted to forgive him as part of their faith and what they felt commanded to do. Some people, their journey to forgiveness took a long, long time and took a lot of work and prayer. Some people had no intention of forgiving him because Dylann Roof never repented. He never asked for their forgiveness. He never showed any remorse at all, and so they felt no desire or calling to forgive him, and still don't. So this was a very a very wide distribution that I felt was important for people to understand. And to understand that, I think you really need to know them. You need to know them as people. You need to know who their loved one was, who they lost. And that's really what I wanted to do, was to paint this picture for a reader that would really make you feel like you're there, really make you feel like you know them, like you're having an opportunity to meet them, get into their heads and understand their thinking and their faith. And that complexity was really the number one thing that I wanted to communicate.
Yeah. And the complexity comes through, certainly, it comes through on that personal level, and I think also on maybe on a communal level as well. That there's no simple answer to these questions on a larger level either. And we like to have that. In Charleston there were the bridge march of solidarity, and that we sort of like to have that easy narrative, and that puts an end to it. Or even at the end of, it's sort of where the book ends. To fast forward, Dylann Roof gets he's sentenced. And you even have the phrase that seems to put justice is served, at least in name. And, he's found guilty and sentenced. It puts a neat bow on it, but those are some narratives, some perspectives, and yet
real life isn't like that.
It's messy, and that's, I guess, another way to put it is, real life has all those undercurrents and that messiness. All those different perspectives are still kind of rolling through life.
And that's what that I think is what, if you as a reader if you want to relate to the story, you have to understand that your life, my life, and their lives don't have neat bows at the end of any part of our life, and certainly not after something as traumatic as this.
Yeah.
But there was something accomplished in the trial. So the trial happened 18 months after the shooting. So that's a long time for people to be waiting and suffering and dealing with the trauma and the loss and not knowing what's going to happen to him. But the reality is, after the trial and after people were able to overcome the hurdles of things like testifying against him and reliving what happened and hearing the details of what happened, there is a degree of closure. So I wanted to, you have to end the book somewhere,
yes.
right? And so I felt like this was a place where there was some closure, but I also wanted to communicate the idea that all of their lives will continue, and despite what closure the trial brought, their loved ones were still gone. And the people who survived were still traumatized. They still had to live with the memories of what happened. That continues on, and that creating that sort of whole experience is what I hope to do for the readers, where we understand after each of these shootings, it could be in Parkland or Las Vegas or Pittsburgh, that there's a whole community and a whole and entire families that are really disrupted in really significant ways that are not obvious on the surface of things like a funeral or a person lost. It's this whole enormous impact, and that's what I wanted to get across. And so hopefully, if you leave, I did not just think I'm spoiling anything, but at the end of the book, Jennifer Pinckney, the pastor's wife, is driving home to Columbia, and she has to go back to her life and raising their daughters. And I tried to create something that was sort of bittersweet. She still had him in her heart, and she had put this trial behind her, but now she still needed to move forward as a single mom, raising their daughters, and that's just the reality of what her life was at that point.
Yeah, and that's it. There's no easy answer, no easy closure, but there is some movement forward and some closure along the way. That it is, we don't end with easy answers, but there are some answers, and there's some good news along the way, even amid all the trauma. And I think that's really something incredibly moving and compelling. It's painful, but we do get so intimately and intensively involved in the lives of these people, the lives of the survivors, like Jennifer Pinckney and one of her young daughters were at the church. They were essentially witnesses during the shooting, So.
And even today, Jennifer, I've kept in touch with her some, and to see the impact of this as their daughters grow up, and in one of them, it's really neat to see how she's in some ways stepping into Clemente's shoes. She is, a great speaker. She's very interested in current affairs. She's very interested in pushing for some of the issues that were really important to her father, and it's neat to see how they're very committed to his legacy, and to see what comes out even far beyond this book. But to know that those girls are okay, I think is something that many people want to know about, and whether it's today or in the book. But to know that they're okay, and that their mom is okay, and that she's done a great job raising them without him, despite the just enormous hardship. Jennifer's mother died around the time of the 1-year anniversary on top of it, and to imagine what she's been through, and is still able to be a great mother, and she's a librarian, and
yes,
to know that she's still doing her work for her students is, to me, just really inspiring.
Yeah, and that might be the word, one of the words. There are many, but okay. They're making it through. They're making it through, and it's messy. They're anytime something like this happens, a traumatic event, it's messy, and it magnifies the emotions around the event. But they're making it through. They're okay, and it's sort of day to day. And if we put a trigger warning, as they say, on this book, I think it's less, you have to describe the violence of the night and the ugliness, and you do that in very, journalistic, detached terms, only what's necessary. But the real trigger warning, I think, it's not even the racist hatred of involved with the shooter. I think it's the difficulty of having to watch these people go through the loss and struggle with that, with the aftermath. It's really intensively gutting to have to get so involved with their lives, and that's what's so unique about this book.
After the shooting, I started thinking about it like this: that you have in any of these tragedies, but this is obviously the one I know the best, is that you have this point of impact in a community where I think of the survivors and the families as being, they're the people most affected. So if you throw a rock into a body of water, you see the splash where it impacts. But then you see these ripples going out and out and out and out. And to me, that's what happens in the community. So you have the families and the survivors whose lives are disrupted, who suddenly are living beneath this tremendous national spotlight. And then you have people like the police officers who went into the fellowship hall that night not knowing what they were going to find, not knowing if the shooter was still there, not knowing where he might be. They didn't know the layout of the church on the inside. Then you have the hospital workers who are waiting for any victims, and where only one arrived. Mm-hmm. Then you have people like Governor Haley, and you can go out and out and out. Those ripples spread far, far, far and wide and affected many people. And so it wasn't only the story of the people directly affected, but there was a whole national conversation going on. There was the impact across the community. It really had a tremendous broad effect that I thought was important to talk about, and to put it into the context of things like the conversation at that time, of course, a somewhat different conversation about race, conversation about the white supremacist websites that Dylan Roof mined, and that apparently gave rise to his views and inspired him to do this horrible thing. I wanted to put it into that kind of context. And again, that's the kind of depth that I felt we could achieve in a book that is difficult to get quite as much in a newspaper. But it was in the middle of an important context in a city that had an important history in that context. And so that I wanted the city to also be sort of a character in the book, to understand Charleston was the epicenter of the slave trade, and where the Civil War started. It played so many roles in this nation's racial history that I felt like that was also important to talk about.
Yeah, yes, and the church as well, was chosen at Denmark, VC, and the history who had planned. He planned and aborted slave revolt, and so that's why that church in particular had been targeted.
Possibly. Now, Rufus never said for sure that that's why he targeted it, but it certainly seems like that.
Seems likely.
Would be a possibility.
So it's, and the history of Charleston, how did you make it a character in the book?
Well, here's an example. So the night of the shooting, so Emanuel sits on Calhoun Street, which is named after John Calhoun, who was, pro-slavery. He famously said that slavery was a positive good, and certainly somebody who was a defender of it. He was pre-Confederacy, but he nonetheless fed the views that led to secession. So the church is on Calhoun Street. As you mentioned, the church was the spiritual home of Denmark Vesey, and where he was worshiping and was a class leader at the time he planned the slave rebellion. So think of just the night of the shooting. The survivors went from Emanuel across the street to a hotel, and then the officials quickly moved them to another hotel because that one was very close to the church. It became clear that hundreds of people, church members, family members, were flocking in. So they moved it to the Embassy Suites, which is a short distance away, but the survivors then walked down Meeting Street past the Calhoun statue, which is now removed, passed away to Hampton Monument, and they reached the Embassy Suites Hotel, which had been the original arsenal that was built after the Vesey Rebellion to keep an eye on the black population, to ensure that people were adhering to the many, many laws that governed where freed and enslaved people could go, when they could go. And so the very structure that they were in was built for that purpose of suppressing African Americans in the community. And you can just go on and on and on, where everywhere in Charleston that you go is a part of this story. And sometimes it's not even very well known. And that's what I tried to do, was to explain, to put that into that context. And another interesting piece, and I don't want to give too much of this away because I hope your viewers will read the book, but Felicia Sanders, who was one of the survivors, her son was killed. Her elderly aunt was killed, and she saved her little granddaughter by playing dead in the blood of their loved ones. So Felicia was a lifelong Emanuel member. Her family had been there for generations, as had her husband, Tyrone's. But after the shooting, they became very upset by ways that they felt they were treated by church leaders, and they left. Well, Felicia left and wound up going right behind Emanuel, which is a church called Second Presbyterian, an historically white church, which is the original home of Denmark VC. So Denmark VC, when he was enslaved and didn't have a say in where he worshiped, was a member at Second Presbyterian. He left and went to Emanuel to find spiritual freedom. And here's Felicia leaving Emanuel to go to Second Presbyterian to find spiritual nourishment herself. And so that kind of closed this interesting historical loop that really speaks volumes to things like the fact that Charleston churches are extremely segregated still today, as are many churches around the country, but we're talking about Charleston, that those separations, those silos that we live in remain in many ways, even long after the days that Denmark VC lived. So I wanted to tell that story and put it in that context of Charleston's history.
And it is, you've lived in Charleston for 20 years. It's a unique city, even for the South. And, in your title, you do refer to this as the Charleston Church Massacre. That just seems, and I know people outside of South Carolina will recognize that as, that it might have been a publisher's choice or something. But I do, it's a curious phrase, the Charleston Church, because it does bring the city in that way, maybe.
Well, people know. They know the city, and they have a sense of that intrigue and that sort of juxtaposition between the beautiful Charleston and the ugliness of that history. And I think that's part of that mystique, I think, for people outside of the city. I think that's part of what draws them here. And it's been interesting, actually, since the shooting to see more awareness of things like, say, our plantations and how do plantations present their history. There's been a lot of grappling with that. When I first moved to Charleston, I remember going to one of the local plantations, and they were talking about African American artisans. And I remember thinking, I'm from Chicago, thinking, what does that mean? Does that mean an enslaved person? Does that mean a freed worker? Who is that? And today, when you go to the plantations, most of them are really trying to do a better job. I wouldn't have said that several years back, but now we're seeing a lot. There's places like Middleton Place and Drayton are really trying hard to figure out how to present that history with the balancing the beauty of the physical space. And so it's going to be interesting to see how that comes together.
Yeah, and this did... this event and your coverage of it in the papers, but I think also this book, has had an impact in the way we view that history. But this event, in the immediate after effects, we did see that the Confederate flag, for example, the battle flag came down from the State House grounds, and that's you do cover that in the book as well. And
that was really interesting to see that, and then now to follow that forward into things like seeing the Calhoun Monument removed. So I found the flag debate to be really interesting because it brings to light the whole thing that we're talking about here, which is the history of the South and what that history is and the complexities of that. But I thought a really telling moment was when the flag came down. There was an enormous crowd gathered in Columbia. There was much celebrating going on. But I was talking to Reverend Joe Darby, and Reverend Darby is a very prominent AME minister, an official in the NAACP, and he's long been a civil rights activist, very widely known in Charleston, around the state. So Reverend Darby said to me, well, all it took was the deaths of 9 black people. And I thought, Wow, that's really interesting. So we're celebrating what happened, the community is celebrating, but at what cost? And why did it require the deaths of 9 Black people? I thought that was a really interesting context, and as we've moved forward, I think there's been much more awareness of that, much more awareness of things like the conversation about forgiveness, for example. Originally, that response was very widely celebrated. People were very inspired by the family members who spoke those words. But as some time has gone by, I hear more conversation about the question of, does that forgiveness essentially let the community off the hook of making really more meaningful changes to things like, for instance, at our newspaper, we ran a series not long ago about school disparities called Minimally Adequate. And South Carolina still has tremendous racial disparities in its education system. So did the conversation about forgiveness allow us, particularly white people, to say, okay, now we've done these things, the flag is gone, and now we've marched on the bridge and celebrated unity. Does that not force the conversation that really needs to take place about these disparities and what needs to be done? And we're seeing more of that just nationwide regarding policing, for instance, now. But this history of racism affects many, many things, and in South Carolina, they're glaring. So the question is, did we miss the boat on making substantial changes that need to be made?
And what is that, I guess that's the, do you see this event as part of a larger continuing story? Is this part of the, would you call it part of the Black Lives Matter movement? Do you think it's connected?
I think so. Not in the sense of police violence, because in this situation, the family members were very pleased with the way the police department handled it. But in terms of the broader question of systemic racism, yes, definitely. And I remember, I'll use one example. So Sharon Risher, whose mother was killed in the shooting, Sharon has become a gun rights or gun law reform activist, and she and others have been really disappointed in the way that in how there has been really no major reforms to gun laws, including what's called the Charleston loophole. That conversation's kind of gone by the wayside. They've been really disappointed to see that there wasn't, as I said, more attention given to the kinds of things that give rise to these white supremacist websites, and the fact that they exist. And Sharon made the point before Dylann Roof's trial. She was extremely stressed out about the trial, very, very worried that one Dylann Roof sympathizer would wind up on the jury and it would be a hung jury, and that Roof would potentially go free. Although realistically he wouldn't have, because he still faced state charges. But this was the source of a lot of stress for her. I remember her saying to me several times, how many Dylann Roofs are there out there? How widespread is this? You look at a website like Stormfront with its 100,000 members, how prevalent is this? It brought a lot of attention to the fact that this subtext of people like Roof, or who at least held these white supremacist views, were substantial. And obviously we're still having that conversation. Just the other night after the debate, President Trump got into hot water making a comment, well, A, refusing to denounce white supremacy, but then B, making a comment about a white supremacist group. It's still here. We're still talking about it. It's still part of the conversation. And now I'd say in some ways really even more than ever. And yet we've just not done the work to adequately address it yet.
So it's it still seems to be lingering, not only in South Carolina but nationwide. But it is, it's a major story, and there were, some of the Confederate iconography certainly, there was some changes there, but maybe that's, those were more symbolic acts than the deeper systemic changes.
And it's not to say that those weren't important. It's not to say that the lowering of the Confederate flag wasn't important, but it is that deeper, those more systemic issues that I still see the country in Charleston grappling with. One thing on the flip side that was really inspiring to see was how individuals came forward and how particular churches came forward, and churches really wanting to address these issues and also really having conversations about things like forgiveness. There were positive changes that came out of it. One that I like to mention, because I think it's something that can be done anywhere, is in Charleston, Emanuel's daughter church, Mount Zion AME, it has a pastor who is Clemente Pinckney's very close friend, Kylon Middleton. And so there, Kylon Middleton's church, and then right next to it, Grace Episcopal Church, which is an historically white church, got together and began a book study. And they would discuss books that had to do with race and essays that had to do with race, and bring people together to have more intimate conversations who just wouldn't normally be sitting at a table having that kind of conversation, and really trying to hear one another in a way that you're not going to if you sit perhaps in a cubicle next to somebody at work, or you see them on the other side of the street. And the idea is to bring people out of those silos so that they're coming together to just, if nothing else, to know each other as human beings and to have a common framework and in the language of the church and the language of the Bible. And I thought that was a really neat effort, and it would draw sometimes 60, 100 people to those book studies. It doesn't even have to be books about race. It could be books about anything, but the idea being people were coming together and having honest conversations that can move the ball in smaller ways, but still very important ways.
Yeah. Do you feel like that might be, the way a way forward? Is it in churches on a local level?
I have started to think there's sort of two prongs. There's the public policy piece that deals with things like disparities in schools, that has to do more with things like funding, access to technology, access to quality teachers. That's more of a policy realm. But I do think there's a personal realm where each of us can step outside our comfort zone a little bit or a lot, to try to make a difference in a small way. And it's something like even thinking about, who do you invite over to dinner to your home? Do they all look like you? Is there a way that you can get to know, in this case, it's people at another church? I think churches are a logical place to start because they're very important anchors in our communities. Also, like I said, they have a common language and a common kind of format that people understand that gives you a place to start, that can be difficult if you're in the community. But I do think that coming together in a personal way. I remember Dr. King's daughter came and spoke at, I believe it was on the first anniversary after the shooting. She spoke to a crowd gathered to remember the event, and she made the point of sort of assigning making an assignment to the crowd, and she said exactly that her father had talked about this, and she wanted to encourage them to really get to know, find ways to know people in more intimate ways, to go out for a beer together, have them over to your home for dinner, where it's not the formal, now we're gathered to discuss race in this auditorium and that sort of thing, which generally I've found attracts people of like minds, where this sort of interpersonal conversation, I think, can help people get past their preconceived notions in a way that, hearing a speech maybe can't.
Yeah, and that it seems like a simple assignment, but simple yet for some reason so difficult to accomplish. I wonder how many people went out and did that. There seem invisible roadblocks for some reason that it doesn't happen enough.
Well, into the schools. One thing we found in that series was that Even in very diverse communities, children still tend to go to schools that are predominantly of their race. So in Charleston County, for instance, you may have students who live in one community, but the white kids go to this school and most of the African American students go to this school. And in the rural communities, many of the old segregation academies still exist, sometimes under a different name, but they still operate somewhat similarly in that the local public school is still predominantly black and the private school is predominantly white. Well, how do we as a community know each other? A lot of the parents I know are parents that are my children's friends' parents, or they play a sport with those kids, and I get to know their parents sitting on the bleachers. You know, it's those kinds of ways that we've separated ourselves from one another and need to find ways to come back so that, like I said, we know people as people. And that was one of the things with Dylan Roof. He said himself that he acquired his views online, that a black person had not ever wronged him in any way. So he's not forming his views based on people he actually knows or circumstances that are real to his life. He's just reading them online and coming up with this stuff. And I think that's where, on a much lesser level, we can cling to our biases because we don't know people personally to see that our biases are unfounded.
Yeah, and that's, you know, part of the good work of the book here is that we meet people, you know, we meet a number of people here, you know, the 9 victims, but also all these family members I feel like in considerable depth, that we really do. I feel like we share a beer, or, you know, we go over and have dinner with them. We get to know them, and, you know, with these quirks and details of their personalities, and we find that they're a lot. They deal with things the way that we would deal with them, and so it's, you know, that's it's very humanizing and humbling, you know, for us, and to see that. So that's that's important to recognize that.
And you see, at least for me, I would often ask myself, you know, how would I react in that situation? Would I have been one of the people who spoke of forgiveness? Would I find that really difficult? It really made me think, and I hope it makes other people think about how would I react, and what are my priorities in that situation? Going back to Jennifer, you know, it was really important to her to go back to work and to raise her daughters in as normal an environment as possible. For Felicia, it was very important. She and Polly went to as far as I can remember, every court hearing, everything. They were determined that they were going to do everything they had to do to make sure he was convicted. Each person's reaction was different. And it was really interesting to see how they grappled with that as wholly different people. A lot of people think that the 9 people who died were related, or that their families were all members of the church, and that's just not accurate. They're from all different places. They are, with the exception of a couple, not related. So each family was really different and really uniquely interesting, and that's what I wanted to communicate, was that this was a whole broad community of unique people that reacted really differently and interestingly.
They're incredibly diverse and unique, and, you know, just sort of it really is a cast of characters. That the 9 people in the room, you just set it up, and it's hard to imagine you know, how the room of the Bible study could contain all those different energetic personalities. That's, you know, you really, it's amazing. So, and they're really quite unique. So, and you find yourself following along and guessing, but it really is guesswork. I guess, you know, I'd like to think, oh yes, I'd forgive, but you really don't know. You don't, and you feel, I think, almost all sides. You feel all perspectives. You understand how hard it would be to forgive, and you put yourselves in all those different shoes of the folks. So I think it's you do understand how hard that journey is to forgiveness, and you know that there is no easy answer here, and certainly on a larger level, the community level, that maybe some things need to change before forgiveness happens.
And I think one thing I didn't get into in the book that was interesting afterward was that, so you remember the Tree of Life shooting in Pittsburgh at a synagogue there? A group came down to visit Emanuel, and I got to talking with the rabbi's wife, and she was explaining, I grew up in a Jewish household early in my life, and in the Jewish faith, like, you would not just forgive somebody because that's what you should do. You would forgive somebody because they've repented and asked of you forgiveness. But it was interesting to me to then see the Christian view of you're forgiven as you would forgive others. And so the family members there felt very compelled to forgive because of that teaching, where the Jewish families involved in Tree of Life, it was different. That if the shooter didn't ask for their forgiveness, why would you grant that? Felicia stood up. I remember when we held an event, when the book was first launched, she and her husband came, and somebody asked a question about forgiveness, and she stood up and she said, forgiveness for me wasn't only for God, it was also because I needed that for my sanity, so that hatred and malice did not destroy me. It was so that I could let that go and focus on my son and focus on my aunt and the people who died and my own faith and that sort of thing. But her husband said, who was standing right next to her, he said that he did not forgive Dylann Roof and had no intention of forgiving Dylann Roof. He hadn't repented at all. He wasn't sorry. He, in fact, said afterward he had not shed a tear for the innocent people he killed. And so her husband, Tyrone, was of the view of he wasn't forgiving him at all. And of course, Felicia joked that she was still working on him and all that. And it was an interesting exchange, though, just to see that even within their own dynamic, there was disagreement. And I will say, during the trial, one of the most poignant, gut-wrenching moments was when they read that writing that Roof wrote a few weeks after in this journal in his jail cell, that he had not shed a tear for them. And to hear those words read out loud in court, and to imagine the pain that must have caused them on top of everything else was really difficult then to imagine forgiving him, even among the people who wanted to, because they felt that's what their faith taught.
Yeah, that's it's I know that the root word of mercy is it shares an etymology with merchant and commerce, and that's so the Christian concept does have that idea of exchange, that it's only good if you exchange it with someone else. But you understand that, especially when on the other side someone's not interested at all and is just seems hollow, that makes it, and has done so much damage. It's very difficult, although there is that moment you record where Dylann Roof's grandmother sheds a tear in court, and so there's but the family has not, his family hasn't spoken out at all. But
no, and I wish they would, because I think that's one of the great unmined pieces of this is Roof himself said he wasn't raised in a racist environment. We have to take his word for that. I've not found evidence that they were sort of closet white supremacists with the views that he held. But his grandfather and grandmother apparently were very respected in Columbia. And you think, what is it like for them now? And what is it like for his parents, or what is it like for his sisters? They wouldn't talk to me, and I always wondered that, of what it's like for them, because I think that's a piece that the public doesn't understand in any tragedy like this, is that there are many, many, many people affected by it. And I'm really thankful that we could share the story of the survivors and the family members who are suffering, but I always wondered about them as well, and what they're like and what this has done to their family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just the ripple effects out there, and so much damage and trauma, but there are those little pockets of hope as well, and the connection between the family members that of the survivors, the positive connections that weren't in sympathy that weren't there before, that folks who become friends and supporters, and so there's hope there too. And I think the book inspires. It's not an easy hope, or there's no simple answer, but it does. I think it is, despite all the difficulty, and it's really about difficulty, there is, it's hopeful ultimately.
And I think ultimately they're hopeful people as a whole. I think most of the family members that I could think of, a couple maybe less so, but by and large, most people are just motivated, I think, by hope through really dark, terrible times. And I remember this scene during the trial. The families all gathered in one area away from the press and the public, and how they all came together and got to know one another, and the way they were able to form these bonds, many of whom barely knew each other. That was really neat. And to see how each of them has moved forward is inspiring, because it's really hard to imagine what it'd be like to go forward after something like that. Yeah. But many of them have found new callings. I mentioned Sharon with gun advocacy, Anthony Thompson, another pastor his wife was killed. Reverend Thompson has done amazing things talking about forgiveness, and he's just a wonderful man, and he speaks often around the community and elsewhere about forgiveness and his faith, and how that has strengthened him. He's an amazing man, and I could go on and on through them as ways that they've found to try to make the death of their loved one mean more moving forward, and trying to improve the world really as a result. And that's, at its heart, that's it's just amazing. It really is just amazing given what they've gone through. Yeah.
That even, and that's sort of the lesson about forgiveness, that it does help it helps, that evil can devour good, I guess, but it devours itself. You're just hollow, and that goodness replenishes, that it moves forward, and these people are moving forward. So the forgiveness helps. If they can get there, it is replenishing. And so thank you for this book, and I do hope folks will read it, because it is a good, responsible thing to do in itself, and you really get in touch with a lot of other lives there. And I do want to ask what you're working on now, because I know you took some time off to come up and be with us today. So,
well, so I still have my normal life. I'm a reporter at the newspaper, and working on a few different things. One that'll come out in the next few months that I think will be interesting is so Charleston is turning 350 years old this year. And so I'm taking a look at some of going back to the idea that wherever you go in Charleston, there are these stories, and many of them are unremembered or little remembered in the community, and particularly with all of the new people who are moving in. So we're going back and looking at different places around the city that are not well remembered but have important historical meaning. One, I'll give an example, is the Workhouse, which was a place where enslaved people were taken essentially to be tortured. And it was just this horrific place. It was right by the old city jail, where many people do go because it's basically a tourist stop now. But what's gone that was right beside it was this huge building that was enormously impactful in the community, and interestingly made a lot of money for the city. And so there's these old important stories that are little remembered, and I want to go through the city and talk about some of those that we do need to keep at the forefront.
Wow. so unburying that buried history in a city that's full of stories, and so that's a wonderful project, and so you're really digging into the archives.
Get to go back into the very old newspapers and see what Charleston was like then, which is a disturbing exercise, but I think an important one.
Yeah, so that's fantastic, and so we'll look forward to that. And you're still going around and doing a lot of the book talk things.
Doing so,
as well.
Coronavirus has obviously changed everything.
Yes,
but,
a lot of virtual book
exactly.
talking.
Learning Zoom and all that stuff.
Yes, as well. So and it's an important story to keep going. So, doing important work down there, in the holy city, and which is sometimes earns that name, and other times we might question it. But
I've heard that was said in jest. So I'd like to know
yes.
if that's true or not.
Yeah, sometimes more than others. So, but thank you so much for being here, Jennifer Berry Hawes, and we'll check and see if we have hopefully some folks dialed in with some questions out there while we were talking. We'll check and see. All right. Well, we have some folks just praising you, waving and saying this is very interesting, deep history. I love the book talk meeting coming together. So just words of praise for you, Jennifer. So,
and I would encourage people who are interested that book talk format seems to be one that is, it's just less intimidating for people who aren't going to go to a big sort of formal conversation about race. It can be small, it can be just a few people, but I do think that's a format that can be fairly easily replicated. Whether it's a church group or some sort of other kinds of civic groups that already have, just structures and memberships that are logical to tap. I'd like to see more of that go on. Personally, I think it's a way we can all make a difference in our personal way.
Yeah, and it can spread from there, and that sounds like a great idea. So, really a way to make this event that was so, really so shocking and tragic to kind of make something good out of that bad, as we were talking about. So.
And one that I didn't mention is that a number of the families have started various efforts on behalf of their loved ones. So there's the Clemente Pinckney Foundation, there's the Tawanza Sanders Foundation, there's the Hate Won't Win, which is from Dan Simmons' family. There's if you were to Google the names of the various people who were killed, you'll find that their families, many of them are doing neat things. The Tawanza Sanders Foundation does a lot of work raising money for scholarships because Tawanza was a mentor to many and trying to carry on that legacy and to help students, particularly disadvantaged students, be able to go to college and to not be saddled with an enormous amount of debt. And same thing with the Pinckney Foundation. There's some really neat things to come out of this where people who want to help and want to be part of the conversation or maybe want to just show some kind of gesture. Felicia Sanders' granddaughter, the little girl who was in the room, I know her family has been working hard to be able to pay for her therapy and her needs since, that's another great way to help is to support that little girl. And so you can go through the families and see what they're doing. And that's, to me, really also a really important way that the community can support them. And this was an historic event in our state, and it's a way we can all try to make sure, these are just different ways that we can try to make sure that we're having a positive impact.
Yes. Well, that's so. Again, making something positive out of a terrible event, historic event. So those are great suggestions, and I hope some folks watching out there may take Jennifer up on those suggestions. So, well, thank you so much for being here with us. That was wonderful, and again, this terrific book, Grace Will Lead Us Home, very much worth a read. So please pick it up, and it's wonderful to have you here with us virtually. We wish you could be here with us in person, hopefully sooner rather than later again. And thank you again to our friends of the Waccamaw Library, and thank you to Heather Pelham with her wonderful camera work and her editing afterwards, and of course to Truman Wins, who's on the soundboard and with the making sure our Facebook Live runs, our feed runs so smooth, and with the graphics too. So we love our Georgetown County studio here, our team, our crew. So they're terrific. And again, Jennifer, Berry Hawes, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
And have a wonderful October afternoon.